everyone. In this video, I want to talk about the role of the law in Paul's letter to the Romans. Having just talked about the Christology of Romans in a previous lecture, I want to turn now to think about what the law is doing, specifically what Paul has to say about the law in Romans chapter 2. That's where we're going to spend a bit of our time. And I'm really glad that as we sort of dig into this, we have the opportunity to read John Barclay's book, Paul and the Power of Grace, which is a summary of his sort of magnum opus, basically, Paul and the Gift, which I'm really excited to chat about a little bit. But I want to kind of set this conversation up a little bit. Really what Barclay is doing is responding to E.P. Sanders. E.P. Sanders wrote this book in 1977 called Paul and Palestinian Judaism. And what that book was doing at the time was real major paradigm shift within Pauline and even broader biblical scholarship. Ever since Luther, we have taken what Paul says about justification by faith in relation to works of the law to more or less mean that works of the law refer to earning salvation or works generally. But what E.P. Sanders really highlights is that that's not really how ancient Jews thought. It may have been how medieval Catholics thought, the sort of people that Luther was critiquing, but it's not really how ancient Jews thought. The works of the law didn't refer to, anything that's meritorious or effort-oriented, but specifically what the law prescribes. And ever since E.P. Sanders, we have carried on sort of recognizing that E.P. Sanders is largely right, that when Paul talks about works of the law, we shouldn't sort of expand that reference to refer to any kind of works, period. We should understand this in terms of the Jewish law and what it prescribes. Of course, the hot button issues would be at the forefront of most controversies with Gentiles, like circumcision, Sabbath keeping, diet, etc. But it refers to all that the law prescribes. Well, what has happened, and what I think Barclay is doing by stepping into this conversation, is he's basically pointing out that ever since Sanders, we have been carrying on with this conversation about works of the law as if we understand the other side of this conversation, which is that we're saved by grace, that we've understood what grace is. And he really interrogates this, and I think with some amazing illuminating results that helps even further clarify the nature of Paul's critique of justification by works of the law, or his interest in the fact that that is not the basis of justification, which I think is really, really helpful. So Barclay's book, of course, one of the things that it does in relation to grace and gift giving is demonstrate that ever since Immanuel Kant, we have basically operated with this idea of gifts as sort of something that is given without strings attached. Sort of, that's the nature of a gift. That's a pure gift, right? Anything that is given without strings attached. But of course, we know culturally that this doesn't really work. It may be how we define a gift, but it is not really how we practice gift giving. Think about a wedding. When you are invited to a wedding, you know that you should bring a gift, right? It's a customary thing to do. Except, when you are invited, you are given a registry. You're given a clue as to what the couple wants to receive as a gift, right? The invitation doesn't say you can only come if you bring a gift, but the registry is a not so subtle reminder that you should be bringing a gift, right? It's sort of this gift exchange, invitation, and you bring gifts. Similarly, think about Christmas, right? When you are buying gifts for siblings or loved ones, don't you think about reciprocity, right? It's like you want the gift that you give in return to be somewhat equal in value to the gifts that you're expecting to receive from your siblings or whomever. These are thoughts that one has. Or if a coworker or an acquaintance, somebody that you know, but maybe you don't normally exchange birthday gifts, if they get you a birthday gift, right? Are the thoughts not going to cross your mind? Oh no, I didn't get them a gift for their birthday, or oh, I need to remember when their birthday is so I get them something too. There's always this kind of reciprocity, right? Or even if you go and grab coffee with a friend and someone says, oh, I got you this time, right? The idea is that you'll get them next time. There's this reciprocity. There's this nature of gift exchange. And like I said, definitionally, we might define gifts in a Kantian way as a pure gift, no strings attached. But functionally, that's not really how it works. And in fact, that's not how it worked in the ancient world. And that's what Barclay does a really great job of doing. He highlights this quite well, that gifts were given to initiate and to maintain relationships, right? And what he does as well is he shows that in our rhetoric of grace, often what we do is we perfect the concept, or we sort of take the idea and run it out to its furthest sort of extreme and say, fundamentally, this is what it means for God to be gracious, or this is what grace is, or this is what a gift is. And that taxonomy that he provides of those 6 perfections are really, really helpful. And of course, you've read this by now. You've been thinking about this, hopefully. I'm just going to list them for us, right? These 6 perfections are the priority of the gift, or the priority of grace. The idea that sometimes when we emphasize God's grace, we might be emphasizing the fact that God acted first, right? The superabundance of the gift, how great it is, right? Maybe you needed a bike to get to work, but you got a car. And in that instance, wow, this is way more than I needed. This is super abundant. This is such a great gift, that kind of idea. Or the singularity, the idea that is all that the gift giver is gracious, right? Singularly focused on the fact that God is gracious. That might be what we emphasize, is that it's sort of clouding out other aspects of who God might be, simply focusing on the fact that he's gracious. Or incongruity, the idea that the gift giver is not worthy of the gift, right? That the gift recipient is not worthy of that gift, that the gift recipient is depraved, or something along those lines, that the gift and the gift giver are so great and the recipient is not worthy of it. Or efficacy, the idea that the gift can do something, the idea that the gift is powerful, that the gift can cause to bring about certain realities that it is aiming for. That's the efficacy of the gift, or the efficacy of grace. And then finally, the non-circularity of grace, right? This is the idea that if we perfect this element, we're basically saying that the gift is given without an expectation of return. That's why it's non-circular, that there is no expectation of reciprocity or circularity. And this aspect here at the end is really the one that Barclay's book challenges the most. That when we talk about grace and we emphasize non-circularity, we're really being Kantian, and we're working with an anachronistic way of talking about gift giving that doesn't map onto the ancient world. That's not how they thought about gifts. They did not perfect non-circularity. They understood that gifts naturally come with return gifts. There is this reciprocity. There is this back and forth. And so if Paul is not critiquing circularity when he says that we're not justified by works of the law, for example, and if circularity is expected, it's part of the picture, there's always a gift exchange, right? Then how might this cause us to reconsider, right, some of the things that Paul does when he talks about works of the law and faith and grace and these sorts of things in those contexts that are so charged, especially for a lot of the Protestant Catholic sort of debates, right? Well, I want to kind of dig into this by actually thinking about an example from popular culture really quick. Perhaps you've heard of or seen the TV show called Big Bang Theory. There's a wonderful sequence in the 2nd season in an episode called the Bath Item Gift Hypothesis. And it's an episode all about gift giving. And it's set in the Christmas season. It originally aired in December of 2008. And you have this character named Penny, who lives next door to a bunch of scientists, and these scientists really struggle to relate to her. Penny is a normal, down-to-earth woman, and these scientists are sort of very cerebral and intellectual and just sort of, facts-oriented. And Penny, this neighbor of theirs, gets to know them, sort of like this odd pairing, odd friendships that have occurred. Penny incidentally mentions that she got Sheldon and Leonard, 2 of these science figures, some neighbor gifts. And Sheldon reacts with some concern at this news. Why would you do such a thing? Sheldon asks, to Penny's surprise. And Sheldon goes on to explain, I know you think you're being generous, But the foundation of gift giving is reciprocity. You haven't given me a gift. You've given me an obligation. Penny quickly attempts to alleviate Sheldon's concern by stating that he doesn't need to get her anything in return. But of course I do, Sheldon exclaims. The essence of the custom is that I now have to go out and purchase for you a gift of commensurate value and representing the same perceived level of friendship as that represented by the gift you've given me. Sheldon is clearly distraught by this news that Penny has a gift for him. But he conceives of a foolproof plan to ensure that he does not over or under reciprocate. The plan is that he would go out and purchase multiple gift bags of varying value and keep them tucked away in another room. And once Penny has revealed her gift to him, he would know precisely which gift bag was most comparable in value. And then he would give her that bag, and then sometime later, having kept all the receipts, return all the rest for a full refund. So when it finally comes time to exchange gifts, Sheldon unwraps Penny's present to find a napkin. He's a bit nonplussed at first, and he clearly doesn't know what to make of such a pedestrian gift. And then Penny tells him to turn the napkin over. And after doing so, Sheldon begins to lose his balance, clearly in shock at what's on the other side. It's a note, and it reads, "To Sheldon, live long and prosper, Leonard Nimoy." Of course, Leonard Nimoy is the actor who played Spock in the original run of Star Trek, a legendary icon of Sheldon's. Penny explains, incidentally, in a throwaway manner, how she got it. He came into the restaurant the other day. Sorry, the napkin's dirty. He wiped his mouth with it. At which point, Sheldon abruptly returns to his feet, stumbling out of disbelief, staring incredulously at the napkin, visibly shaking, and says, "I possess the DNA of Leonard Nimoy?" A thought suddenly occurs to Sheldon, and he runs back into the other room, returning with every single gift bag that he had purchased. And at the sight of this, Penny exclaims, "Sheldon, what did you do?" And Sheldon responds with, "I know. It's not enough, is it?" And then rather unexpectedly and awkwardly, Sheldon moves in to give Penny a hug. These scenes in this episode are wonderful for many reasons. Sheldon rightly articulates the no strings attached view of gift giving is problematic. It's not in keeping with the origin of the custom, which is about reciprocity. Sheldon's assumption, however, is that gifts must always be symmetrical, that they must always be proportional, right? And that they should be of the same relative value, right? That's comically upended by Sheldon's reaction to the superabundant gift that he received from Penny. And in response, he gave all the gift bags that he had and even threw in a hug to signify his immense appreciation for the great gift that he had received. And with that in mind, this idea of reciprocity being integral to gift giving, I want us to look at Romans chapter 2. This is a tricky passage. This is a very difficult passage, but I want us to look at this with this concept in mind of gift giving, of reciprocity. If God has given this gift to us of salvation, right, of his grace, what does giving gifts back to God look like? How might that actually help us make sense of certain tricky passages like this one, Romans chapter 2? Let's turn and take a look at that. I want to begin by noting four main approaches to this passage. You really have these options here where some people will read this. It's largely talking about this kind of final judgment scene and the works upon which we are evaluated at the final judgment. Some people say, well, this is hypothetical because we know we're not justified by works, so this is hypothetical. This is what it would be like, and we would all be found wanting, so therefore, Christ takes care of it. We don't have to worry about this. Essentially, Romans chapter 2 in this regard is strictly hypothetical. Another approach is to say, well, this is a text that is showing us the rewards that we will receive, not salvation or not salvation, something like that, but sort of like the quality of salvation or the nature of salvation, additional rewards that might be received as a result of the works that we do. Of course, there are other approaches that say, no, this really is a final judgment by works, and this is integral to Paul's theology, and there's kind of two ways to think about it. One is that our judgment by works confirms the justification that we've already received by faith. So there's a kind of relationship between two verdicts, if you like, a kind of proleptic announcement of being justified, this kind of legal language, right? A proleptic announcement, declaration of a verdict in advance before sort of the trial takes place, that final judgment, if you like, and that these verdicts would be in alignment. That's one idea. Another is sort of like the Catholic view, if you like, the judgment by works as sort of a way of earning salvation, so that our works are meritorious. Okay, so these are some different views. I'm just highlighting these four here. We want to keep these in mind as we turn to look at Romans chapter 2 together now. And I'm going to read the passage, and we're going to kind of take a look at bits of it as we go. Beginning in verse 1. You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things. Now we know that God's judgment against those who do such things is based on truth. So when you, a mere human being, pass judgment on them and yet do the same things, do you think you will escape God's judgment? Or do you show contempt for the riches of his kindness, forbearance, and patience, not realizing that God's kindness is intended to lead you to repentance? Now, carrying on, look at verses 5 to 11. This is where really a lot of the crux of the difficulty of this passage lies. But because of your stubbornness and your unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath against yourself for the day of God's wrath, when his righteous judgment will be revealed. God will repay each person according to what they have done. Notice that retribution, judgment language. To those who by persistence in doing good seek glory, honor, and immortality, he will give eternal life. But for those who are self-seeking and who reject the truth and follow evil, there will be wrath and anger. There will be trouble and distress for every human being who does evil, for the Jew first, then for the Gentile. But glory, honor, and peace for everyone who does good, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For God does not show favoritism. Remember in our previous video, we talked about the impartiality or the fairness of God, that's part of his righteousness. Here we see this judgment text emphasizing God's fairness, his impartiality, right? People are being judged on the same basis, whether Jew or Gentile, etc., right? So again, is this hypothetical? Is this about rewards? Remember, is this about earning salvation? We talked about some of this just as a kind of itemized way of summarizing what we're seeing in this passage, right? It's clearly about the judgment of God. It's clearly about the day of wrath. God's righteous judgment is going to be revealed. He's going to repay everybody according to his works, as verse 6 says. For those who do good work, it's eternal life, not rewards, eternal life. Verse 8, for those who do not obey, it's wrath and fury. So not rewards, damnation, right? Verses 9 through 11. There's no partiality in God's judgment. There will be anguish and distress for those who do evil, glory, honor, and peace for those who do good. So as we look at this, doesn't seem to be about rewards and certainly doesn't seem to be hypothetical. We can keep that in mind. If you're inclined in that direction, that's all right. But this is pretty matter of fact, right? This is the basis for God's judgment, right? So then I think we're left with the third and fourth options that we should consider, at least. But here I think in this next paragraph is what makes all the difference. But it is a little tricky and it involves an important exegetical decision that we're going to take a look at. Look at verses 12 to 16 now. All who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law. This is referring to Gentiles, people who are outside of the law, who are not under the law, who do not adhere to the customs and the prescriptions within it. And all who sin under the law will be judged by the law. Jewish people are under the law, right? So they will be judged by the law, is this idea, right? Verse 13. For it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous, right? So not just hearing it, and as Paul's going to say, not just having it, but doing it is what matters, right? Those who do the law will be declared righteous. Now, verse 14 is really the crux here, and we're going to circle back to this, and we could translate this in some different ways. So just keep in mind that the way this is translated is going to incline you to think about it in a particular way. We're going to interrogate this a little bit. But verse 14, indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. This will take place on the day when God judges people's secrets through Jesus Christ, as my gospel declares. So like I said, verse 14 is really crucial, but let's just think about the features of this paragraph here, right? We see that there's judgment under and apart from the law, right? Those who are under it, the Jews; those who are apart from it, Gentiles. We see explicitly that it's the doers of the law who will be justified, right? And then verses 14 and 15 talk about people who don't have the law and yet do the law, right? We're going to look into that a little more closely, but it talks about people who don't have the law and yet do it. Who is that referring to is the question, okay? But then notice verse 16 reiterates that this is final judgment. This is the end time judgment, right? The day when Christ judged the secrets of all people, right? Well, I have to tell you that for the longest time, this passage really perplexed me, and I really didn't know what to think of it. And I would always tell my friends that as I worked on the Apostle Paul's writings for my PhD, that I basically felt like I could make sense of how Paul talks about the law, how he talks about the Spirit, etc. In just about any place. I felt like everything fit together except for Romans chapter 2. I felt like Romans chapter 2 was this fly in the ointment that always disrupted my thinking. And I would tell my friends, I'm basically gonna act like Romans 2 isn't there because I can't make sense of it. I don't know how it fits. And what happened was one day I was reading through Romans in German just to freshen up my German and get some good practice and just making use of theological German, which is important for biblical studies, PhD in biblical studies, to know German, to use German. So I was reading Paul's letters, and when I got to Romans 2. Because I was reading in German, I was reading slow, and I was, thinking about grammatical relationships in ways that, I certainly don't do in English, right? It's more intuitive. So I'm thinking about the language a little bit more. And as I got to verse 14, a thought occurred to me that had never occurred to me before, but the German of it all prompted me to ask this question. And I thought to myself, oh my goodness. And then I went back to the Greek text and I looked at it closely, and I thought, wait. So the punctuation in the Greek text is not original. It's a convention that was added. And I thought to myself, wait. It's a matter of this particular word. What is it modifying? Can we move the comma? Because if we move the comma, and I'll show you what I mean. If we move the comma, I think I can make sense of this passage now for the first time in my life. And I texted my buddy, who I always told I'm never going to understand Romans 2. I've consigned myself to never understanding Romans 2. I was like, meet me at the pub in 5 minutes. I ran there and I was like, all right, here's what I think. If I can move this comma, I can make sense of this passage. And he's like, yeah, that's how I move the comma. That's how this guy does. And that's how these people. And he's like, lots of people move the comma in that way. And I was like, I don't know why it took me this long. I don't know why, but I feel like, okay, I now have a grip on this passage, or at least I think I do. And it was such an illuminating moment. And I want to explain what this is now. I really think verse 14 makes all the difference for understanding this passage. And it has to do with asking again, who is this group who doesn't have the law and yet does it? Are we talking about Gentile outsiders? We're clearly talking about Gentiles because they don't have the law, right? Are we talking about Gentile outsiders, people who aren't part of the Christian community? Or are we talking about Gentile insiders, people who are a part of the community, who are not under the law, who are apart from the law, and yet are doing the law? I think we're talking about Gentile insiders. When you read the passage as I presented it to you, you wouldn't necessarily think that because of the comma placement. I'm going to get to this. So what I would say that this passage is doing as a kind of overview before we turn to it is I think it's describing Gentiles who are doing what Jews ought to be doing. So if the Jewish people have the law and Paul's saying it's not the hearers, it's the doers that count, right? Paul is appealing to a group that doesn't have it and yet is doing it. It's sort of making this kind of critique where it's like, wait, if you have it, if you're hearing it, you should be doing it. Why aren't you doing it? Here's a group that doesn't have it and yet they are doing it. And there's a Jew-Gentile contrast here, right? What has happened a lot of times, a lot of commentators do this, a lot of translations suggest this, is that verse 14 is appealing to people who are under natural law, who aren't believers, aren't Christians. They're just sort of like people throughout the world who've never heard the gospel, and they're just doing whatever is on their conscience. And if they are consistent with that, then that's good enough. This is how a lot of people understand verse 14. I don't think that's correct. And I think the problem here is the comma placement. And I think that's why I was always so concerned about this passage, because of what Paul says about our capabilities elsewhere. He says that, frankly, we need the Spirit. Without the Spirit, we can't do any of this stuff. So why would he say that people could do things on their own? That's what we're going to get to. The other thing about this passage that I think is important is that there's an allusion to Jeremiah 31. The law being written on the hearts. That seems to be insider language, not outsider language. The law isn't written on the hearts of everybody. It's written on the hearts of new covenant members in Jeremiah 31, which I think is really significant. So let's think about this idea that commas, at least in general, that commas make a difference, that commas are significant, right? I have a couple slides to illustrate this, right? Look at this one here. Jane enjoys cooking her family and her dog. We need some commas there, right? Use a comma, save a life. Or how about this one? Let's eat, Grandma, right? The difference between let's eat, Grandma, and let's eat, comma, Grandma, right? Punctuation saves lives. Or this one here. Enjoy your Thanksgiving, turkeys, versus enjoy your Thanksgiving turkeys, right? Makes all the difference. And then finally, this last one here of this comma with his therapist saying, I constantly feel out of place, right? Now take a look at verse 14. I've highlighted the comma that I'm referring to, right? Look at this. And in the next slide, you're going to see that I'm going to move it. And now I'm going to read it the way it is here. It says, for when Gentiles who do not have the law, by nature do what the law requires. Look at that. By nature do what the law requires. This is the hang up that I always had. I always felt like there is absolutely no room within Paul's anthropology for Paul to say this, that somebody could by nature do the law. How come the Jews can't do the law, right? Why would Gentiles naturally do the law? That just that never made any sense to me within Paul's anthropology. In other words, the burden of everything that Paul says elsewhere doesn't allow for that. Paul has such a high pneumatology and frankly, not a very high anthropology that he would never talk like this, in my opinion, right? And I realized, oh my gosh, that comma, it's the comma. What is by nature modifying? Is by nature modifying doing the law, or is by nature modifying not having the law? That is the significance. Look at the comma placement here. I've now shifted the comma, right? Who do not have the law by nature. For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, etc. In other words, this passage here isn't stressing how they do the law. It's just commenting on the fact that they've done the law. And what by nature is doing is it's stressing the fact that naturally, so to speak, they don't have the law. They're outside of it because they are different from from Jews. Jews have the law, we could say by nature. Gentiles don't have the law by nature. That, I think, makes all the difference here. And we're going to see this word by nature actually reappear in this passage. And Paul's going to use it in a way that highlights that this is the best understanding of how it's functioning in verse 14. Look at verses 17 and following. Now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and boast in God, if you know his will and approve of what is superior because you are instructed by the law, if you are convinced that you are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in the dark, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of little children, because you have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? As it is written, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. So you can see this stress, right? We saw how the Gentiles, they don't have the law by nature, yet they're doing it. This is part of Paul's critique against Jews who have the law and aren't doing it, right? And then this is how it all comes to a close, the end of chapter 2. Look at verse 25 and following. Circumcision has value if you observe the law. But if you break the law, you have become as though you had not been circumcised. So then, if those who are not circumcised keep the law's requirements, right? Not naturally, just if they're keeping it, right? Will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised? The one who is not circumcised physically, this is that same thing by nature. Those who are not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you, who even though you have the written code and circumcision are a lawbreaker. That language there of the one who is uncircumcised physically, it's by nature. It's the same thing. Those who don't have the law by nature do it. Here, those who aren't circumcised by nature yet do it. It's the same thing. It's the same idea. Verse 28 and 29 now. A person is not a Jew who is one only outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God. Again, that language that's so reminiscent of the Jeremiah 31 stuff that we just saw in verse 15, right? Being written on the heart. So what we have here at the end of chapter 2, right, is even though the Jews had the law, they didn't do it, right? And the value of circumcision, right? And the uncircumcised keep the law. They are circumcised by faith, right? The idea is that those who are apart from the law, they're actually doing it, right? And it's the doers that will be justified, as verse 13 says, right? And I think this makes all the difference. In fact, this helps us make sense of what Paul is doing specifically in Romans 8. So if we keep this idea in mind, that in Romans chapter 2, Paul is stressing that there are some Gentiles who are outside of the law, yet they're doing it. And I've stressed that I don't think within Paul's theology, he would ever say that anybody does the law naturally, right? And I think this becomes explicitly clear in Romans 8, 1-4. This comes right after chapter 7, where, in chapter 7, Paul is wrestling with this, the things I want to do, I don't do. The things I don't want to do, I do, right? I think there's obviously a couple different ways to understand this, but one way to understand it is Paul is emphasizing what happens when one lacks the Spirit and is not able to do the law without it. I think that's what's going on in Romans 7, because when we get to chapter 8, there's this real strong pendulum shift where Paul is talking about what the Spirit does and how those who belong to the Spirit are not part of the flesh. We could say a lot more about that, but I just want to look at Romans 8, 1-4 to close this out. Therefore, There is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, because through Christ Jesus, the law of the Spirit who gives life has set you free from the law of sin and death. For what the law was powerless to do because it was weakened by the flesh, God did by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh to be a sin offering, and so he condemned sin in the flesh. Notice how he has addressed the flesh problem through the death of Jesus. And look at the purpose statement in verse 4. In order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fully met in us, who do not live according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. The righteous requirement of the law is fulfilled by those who walk according to the Spirit. How are they able to do this? Because of what Christ has done, right? They're able to do this. This, I think, is building upon what we saw in chapter 2. How are these Gentiles who do not have the law by nature, how are they able to do it? Not by their own doing. It's because of the law being written on their hearts, as is alluded to in Jeremiah 31. It's because the flesh was dealt with by Jesus on the cross. It's because his Spirit energizes them in order to do it. Now, the reason why I think this is so significant in light of this conversation about works of the law, and specifically works in relation to the final judgment, if we recognize that what Paul is doing when he critiques works of the law or says that that's not the basis of justification, if we recognize that what Paul is doing is he's not sort of scrapping the idea of circularity, going back to the gift-giving idea, then we recognize that the life that we do of good works or of sort of growing in sanctification, whatever sort of phrase you want to use to think about that, we can conceive of this in light of ancient gift-giving practices as giving gifts back to God, as part of the reciprocity that would be expected in light of the great, incongruous, superabundant gift that we have received from God. Indeed, in light of the efficacious gift that we have received from God, because the point that Paul is getting at is that the gift of the Spirit produces these things, so we don't even earn it. As Barclay says, right? We are unfit, and we receive that perfect gift to make a fit. And that, I think, is a beautiful way of thinking about it. This is not about, earning our salvation. The gift that we received brings about this reality in us. And so it is God's work from beginning to end. And I think that is a beautiful image. And I think that is really at the core of Paul's pneumatology. And I think we see it on display here, especially the way that chapter 8 here develops those themes in Romans chapter 2.